Welcome to the Going Green podcast. And today we're going to have a look at sea rise and sort of look at something that sort of wasn't in the news and then now again suddenly is as it's been raised in the UN.
Yes. So I can't remember his name, was Chief Secretary or
Antonio Guterres?
yeah, it's Antonio Guterres. He's whoever. Uh, he addressed the Security Council. He usually addresses the Security Council, all sorts of things, and he's been moaning about carbon emissions and all sorts of problems of poverty. Yeah, doing his part for raising things. Anyway, so today's message was not only on the carbon things, was he was talking about the sea level rise or how the sea level is rising and the potential mass exodus that will happen if we don't do anything about it. As in, we've already got a terrific number of refugees, and suddenly the world's going to have so much more refugees, and we can't cope with the refugees we've got. So we need to do something to stop these refugees from forming. Yeah, that's what he's going on essentially. But and basically he says that it's a torrent of trouble. He's always good with his lovely snout bites. But yeah, so he's warning about the sea level rise, uh, because it's the not the amount of, but it's sort of it's looking at the landscape, the land, to see what level it is.
And how much land's going to disappear? That's the important bit, isn't it? It's sort of it doesn't matter if sea levels rise. It only matters if sea levels rise and the land starts to disappear, especially the bit you're living on. And in which case, then those people have got to move. So, Paul, let's ask some simple questions. The first of all is about sea level rising. And if I wanted to measure the sea level rise, of course, I'd pop along to the beach and I'd have a look where the water ends, wouldn't I?
Oh, I mean, you can try, but that is not a very good place to measure the sea level rise.
It's tides is the problem, and of course waves. These sort of I tried to measure how deep the water was, and it was sort of about 8 centimeters, and then about sort of
A foot.
50 centimeters,
Yeah,
and then a meter, and then I fell over.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, so one of the common things people say about sea level rise is that they go out and they go to the beach and they said, "Oh, the sea level's not rising; it hasn't changed level," and that's because at the beach it technically hasn't, although it has, but it hasn't. And the reason is because of how the beach is formed, and essentially, it's much shallower going to the depths of the ocean as opposed to being sort of instantaneous drop, almost like a cliff. And so you see the actual the the water sort of, because of the beach is angled and all sorts of things, it actually has to rise up over the beach.
Yeah, so you
Uh,
often see the waves being driven up the shore, can't you? And that isn't sea level.
no, so
So let's ask the question again then, Paul. Where would you go and measure sea level?
and the glorious answer from NASA is apparently in the middle and the Atlantic. I would say why the middle, not of the middle of the Pacific, like somewhere like Hawaii, but once again, Hawaii is a bloody beach. Not a good place to do it. So the answer is the middle of the Atlantic is where they actually take the official measurement of sea level, and that's where they basically, and they said you can do other places. It's not, but you've got to look at the landscape and account for it, and basically compare it against other places to basically say where things are going. If everybody's measurements have gone up, then that's a sign that, of course, sea level is rising. But if your measurement's just gone up, there might be another factor. So it is hard to determine and to see
So so then how do they measure the sea level rise then, Paul? How do they measure the sea level to start with?
um well, it's one of those things where you've got to measure the distance from the ocean floor.
And they do that with
They do it with a sonar buoy. You measure the time in water because it was all water.
I use buoys in this country.
What, not sonar?
Yeah, sonar. Well, yeah, we had ASDIC, but yeah, you can use a sonar buoy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can also use satellite with stuff like lidar, which is sort of a bit cross between lasers and radar to actually estimate, and that's accurate to sort of 1 or 2 centimeters, which is pretty good. And if you find a flat bit of sea, then you can sort of have a look at that. And places like well, the doldrums, there's not much in the way of waves there in the sea, unlike popping outside into the English Channel or the North Sea or
Yeah.
the
I know.
Atlantic.
Yeah. But it's just, as I said, it's one of these things. Anyway, so they've now measured the sea level, and they've been measuring the sea level for the last, I'm going to say, 200 years, from the 1800s or late
Yeah, because
1800s.
they were with ships and doing all that. They were
Yeah,
quite good on
they,
that.
they were
Yeah.
quite good. So to taking a fraction of salt with those older measurements, we've got better over the time. But essentially, what we've seen in the last, say, 200 years, approximate, is that sea level has risen approximately 3 point, 3.8?
3.2 millimeters
Yeah, 3.2 millimeters. And we go, what?
every year.
Yeah,
So since 1880, here's the statistics, the sea level has risen 23 centimeters,
that's it.
or approximately 8 inches. And that's since 1880. But let's be honest then, if we look in the last 25 years, 3 of those inches then, or about 75 centimeters, has happened in those last 25 years. And it looks like it doesn't seem to matter now what we do. Sea level rise is accelerating, and no matter what we do, it will have risen by about 1 foot by 2050.
Mm-hmm. And this is what the whole crisis we're saying is that, let's say you add a foot onto places, you look at the map and the levels of the elevation of the world, and suddenly quite a lot of islands go under a foot, or they're
Yeah, because
only,
they're not that much above the sea level at the moment.
yeah.
Yeah,
You think that sort of the Netherlands, who've been building all these lovely
dikes.
dikes and things. I'm going to say they need to raise all their dikes by a foot to compensate for the rise in sea level. Because, of course, as we know, the Netherlands is basically below sea level, or some places are. And, that's something they're going to have to do. What was it? One of the islands is going to vanish.
Yeah,
Uh,
in Indonesia, one of the
yeah.
islands there. Yes.
And they said they're having to buy a new island to move all the population to that island. Because, of course, their island isn't going to be around anymore.
Yeah, so let's have a look at why is the sea level rising, and we can actually put that down to 3 basic things. One, the world is hotter. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about the Earth being warmer. Therefore, the sea is a little bit warmer, and we know that when the sea is a little bit warmer, water expands, and so some of that sea level rise, probably in the region of about half of the sea level rise, is probably attributable now to having warmer oceans. So the sea hasn't actually no more water's been put in there from this point of view. It's just risen simply because the water is warmer.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like it. I know when I put my foot in the
I
English
know.
Channel.
Yeah, exactly. But it's just amazing to hear this lovely thing that is, because it's warmer, it's rising because of warmth, the heat of the atmosphere, those sort of climates, as opposed to any more water. Because you hear all these problems are sort of saying, all the icebergs are going in, and
I'm
sort of,
coming to that.
I know, but you say the volume of the iceberg sort of displaces the water, and the answer is a little bit, but grand scheme of things, the ocean's a big place. Was it something like 2/3 is ocean? 2/3 is quite a lot of water to raise equally? And the answer is, well, if it's all raised through temperature, that explains quite a lot of the sea level rise. Anyway,
Yeah. Okay, so number one was thermal expansion. Number two are the melting glaciers. So all these sort of mountain glaciers, take your pick, and the winter snows, basically they're shrinking. And where does that water go? Well, I'm sorry, but it eventually falls and goes into the ocean. I was going to say rise, but it doesn't. It falls into the ocean.
yeah, it falls is causing a rise. Yeah.
Yes. So we get a sea level rise because the glaciers have
Fallen. Yeah.
fallen. Yes,
And-
they put ice into the water or more water there.
Yeah, and then thirdly, of course, what I alluded to was these large icebergs that fall off from Greenland or
Yeah, but you
Antarctica.
don't mean an iceberg, do you,
I
Paul?
don't
Not
mean-
really.
We're not talking the iceberg that sunk the Titanic. No, we're talking about these huge sheets of
Yeah, ice sheets. These are miles in size, and some of them a little bit bigger. Now, how does that make any difference? Because you think, well, we got this large piece of ice. How does that make a difference? Well, you know that these icebergs, only sort of 9/10 of them are underwater, and the other tenth is what sticks up. Or people look at it the other way around. It's only a tenth of it. So when basically that water melts, that water now, all of it is in the water, and you haven't got a tenth of it sticking up. And that extra tenth is the sea level.
yes.
So, by 2050, even if we work hard and do lots of things now, sea level rise approximately 1 foot.
Yeah, and it's terrifying to say that this is going, and as I said, if you draw the map and sort of raise everything by a foot, look how much land mass has been swallowed down by the sea. How many more? How far has it crept in? Because it's sort of let's say you take a beach. Well, if it's all under a foot in elevation, slope wise, well then it's all gone. Yeah, the beach has disappeared because it's underwater. It might be only underwater by a bit, but it's still underwater.
And some countries have got real problems like that. We said Indonesia, places like Bangladesh, they are, and Holland, they are basically below sea level or just above sea level, in that it probably won't make an awful lot of difference. But that isn't the major problem. The major problem tends to come when we have storm surges.
Yeah, which is one of those things where it sort of, because it's taking the increased level of water and is then surging a vast quantity of that water forwards. And usually we have let's say a wall, and if it's very low on the wall, the storm surge usually probably the height of the wall. So now we're saying if the water level is creeping up and naturally at this wall, then of course when the storm surge comes, it's easier for it to, not I say jump over the wall, but it's easier for it to actually
Breach the defences, I
breach
think.
the fence. Well, it doesn't need to breach; it just goes over the top, and suddenly, what's the point of building a wall? So it's one of those major, not problems, but there is this huge idea of sea defense, and then everybody says, "Oh well, we need more sea defense because it needs to be higher." And
Yeah. But when it's all right making sea defences, but then when they get breached, and they do, then usually the damage is even greater. A study taken between 1963 and 2012 showed that half of the deaths from all the major hurricanes in the Atlantic were actually caused by the storm surges.
mm-hmm.
And that is quite sort of a bit of devastation. If your house is by the sea and the sea level rises, but it still hasn't got up to your house, yeah, you're fine. Storm surge comes, wipes your house out.
Oh dear.
Yeah, it is really. It's basically you have to live a certain distance away or height above the sea to be safe. So if you live on a cliff, you're a little bit safer until, of course, the storm surge attacks the cliff and the cliff collapses.
Yeah.
And we see that in this country, in the east of England, where some of our cliffs are a
Being
little bit soft, aren't they?
they're eroding away. Yeah, it is a problem. Yeah, but this is one of the major problems with the sea level rising is that it's attacking places that were not never attacked before, and subsequently are not are well, I wouldn't say are able to defend against, but it's one of those things where they're not resilient enough to withstand the damage caused by the water. And so those are places that are much more susceptible to prop damages. Yeah, and we're talking, it could be coastal, but it's also along rivers. If you've got a storm surge up a river, how much of that river is flooded? Uh,
And of course, the damage it does, because instead of having fresh water there, you've now got salt water, and the salt's contaminated all the soil, and things that used to grow there, well, they won't anymore.
yeah, so this is why this is a problem. It's not say, oh, we're going to lose out on flooding. It's not the flooding that's a problem. It's the saltwater contamination of floodwater. So yeah, and this is where this is why people have things like we've got them in the River Thames. They've got
Thames barrier.
Thames barrier.
And we've
That's
talked about that one before, how is it in the first year, it was sort of shut like once or twice. Now it's shut regularly. And maybe Thames Barrier 2 will be required sooner rather than later, further down, to try and protect the Thames Barrier and perhaps other things as well,
yes, it's going to be
like
quite yeah.
London.
Yeah, they are talking about having to increase or build a new barrier or change how this barrier is going a second barrier is going to be built, as in you put sort of a blocking underneath one or a little top one that only takes the top section of water, not the lower. And they talk about all these fancy design because they said, Thames barrier is good enough, but it's not going to cope with the rise because, of course, you can't extend the barrier. And so they said,
And yeah, could even with the Thames Barrier being up, could it be breached? Because did they build it big enough and high enough? And the answer, unfortunately, is no.
they didn't know. And so that's what they're sort of talking about. An idea is sort of looking at the where what to do, but the issues they're coming across isn't that what needs to be done; it's the finance to do it. Or oh, it's going to be breached in 50 years. Well, let's not worry about it in 50 years or in 49 years. That's when we'll do it. And the answer is, but we're seeing it go up and up and up and up. At what point do you say, right, we need to do this, make this change, or to solve or to prevent problems? And what level do you do it at? Do you do it,
Yeah.
say, starting from next year, we need to look into doing this project? Or do you say, right, if it's going up at this rate and it is getting faster and faster and faster, suddenly is it not next year, but is it 6 months from now, sort of thing?
Well, Jakarta's got this project at the moment aimed to protect the city with an 80-foot high seawall. You
Yeah.
know, and that's taking into account all these storm surges where the sea level will rise not by a foot, but by several meters. And you don't want the walls breached, so do you build a really high seawall? Somewhere like Rotterdam, they've been sort of working there, trying to sort of combat the flooding there. And they've built loads of barriers and various other things to try to sort of, well, move the water around. But basically, you can only go so far doing that. The Marshall Islands, they're the ones you were talking about. They just can't build a wall around the whole island. It would
Um,
look silly.
yeah, I'd like to see them try.
It
Yeah.
would look like one of those sea forts outside Portsmouth Harbour.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, we sort of build a little castle and sort
That
of
would do. Well,
sit inside there.
well, this is one of those things that's, talking about the different plans of or the response to sea level rise and different plans. Essentially, is there are lots of different methods, and building a seawall like in Jakarta is what is known as a protect action, and which is designed basically, you build a seawall to protect all the things inside. But there are other ways of doing it, like accommodation, like to accommodate for it, as in build the new buildings on stilts. We're talking about a first floor or a ground floor uh, sacrificial layer, then build the house on top, so that in case it's a problem, in which case then you've got a whole floor worth of rise to compensate for. Not that, as I said, that's to accommodate for the rise, as opposed you pre-built it. Uh, the other type of prevention is what is known as advanced, as in, like the dikes in Amsterdam, you're actually building, raising the ground upwards to meet the rising sea levels, as opposed to, to protect the low lying ground, you build sort of an inverse ditch. You're building the wall up, but you're building it from the land. And as I said, that's what the Netherlands are doing. Here in the UK, we are especially on the coastal areas, we are known as what's doing as a retreat, which essentially is people picking up houses and then moving the houses. I think it's like 200 meters down the road or something. Not, they
Yeah.
literally picking up the house and moving it further down not coast, but
There was
more inland.
one story I heard about someone that did that is they moved their house and now they're going to have to move it again. Perhaps 200 meters or so wasn't enough. If it was me, I'd be thinking about living on a hill. Oh, wait, I do.
Yeah, it was, as I said, not
Yeah. I did some sort of research a while ago, and it said that if the sea level, uh, let's get rid of all the ice, all the world loses all the ice, then the sea level rise would be approximately about 200 feet.
it's something daft like that.
Yeah.
It was
And I live more than that above sea level.
the current.
Yes. However, that would mean I'd live on an island.
That's all right.
I know I live on an island at the moment, but my island I live on at the moment is quite big. The island that I would be living on would be a lot smaller.
Yes. Well, time to invest in a boat.
Ah, yes, I hadn't thought about that. Yes. So, yeah. So basically, how are we going to go about sorting this problem out? Do you look at the figures and say, well, by 2050, sea levels are going to rise by, a foot. So we put in sea level defenses that are going to do that. And then by
Or,
2100, it's gone up even more. Or,
well, I was going to say, or do you sort of build your building accommodating for that 100 foot by putting it on stilts, or by putting this sacrificial first layer in? As I said, there are lots of different mechanisms to not protect yourself, but to mitigate sea level rise. But unfortunately, you could build a wall, great. But how about your next door neighbor? Or a single piece of wall
that's
going to make
missing.
missing is going to make a missing. You need the whole wall across. That
Yeah,
costs a
because
lot.
the sea has this nasty habit of sort of going round little bits, doesn't it? If you don't make the wall full, it just sneaks and goes round the outside, and bit like the Maginot Line in World War Two.
Yeah, and the great problem with all these things is, of course, yes, you can build your house on stilts. Uh, but what about your neighbor? And so, as a community, you need to do some things.
Yeah.
Change the laws to make sure houses are built on stilts. But it's sort of as a global effort. This is the things we need to look into. What we need to change and look into, and we need to adapt, because otherwise we're going to be washed away. Yeah.
Well, places like Bangladesh, And let's just name another place I know, Florida.
Yes.
So, there is one, I suppose, one good thing about this, that countries like Bangladesh, they're suffering. They put out pleas. The Marshall Islands are disappearing. They'll put out pleas, and they'll be largely ignored by some countries. And then those countries will also start to face problems, and then they'll start to do something. But by then, it's going to be too late.
Well, yes, yeah. As I said, it's you hear the classic poem, sort of they came for me and they said nothing, and sort of then they came for the others and I said nothing, and when they came for me, there was no one to say anything, because that's how that's the poem. But it is the Marshall Islands, Bangladesh are crying out now, and places aren't interested, and then suddenly the Marshall Islands are going to vanish, and so no, they won't be saying you need to save the Marshall Islands, because of course there will be no Marshall Islands.
But it's as sea level rises, it's the problems that are also associated with it. So we've got places with mangrove swamps. Now, those mangrove swamps, how well are they going to cope if they're now a foot deeper? It's basically they're going to start to lose some of their sort of surroundings, which is not going to help. So that's mangrove swamps. But how about the coral reefs? They can only be, well, they're certain depth, because that's where the light gets. And if they're that much deeper, is it going to affect the coral reefs? And the answer is almost certainly. And are we going to need new reefs in new places? Yes. And it's not going to happen overnight. We're looking at reducing the area for living and for working. And that's going to give lots of people lots of problems. If you work on the land and you haven't got any land, well, you're called a fisherman then. And people are having to change their livelihoods, how they're going to work. Are you going to sort of just build river levees? But we've seen how well they work in North America, haven't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, they work really well until they don't.
Mm-hmm. Precisely, and this is for constant maintenance, and then there's the problem of constant level of sort of but we've just paid for a wall. Don't tell me we have to pay for another wall. Why can we not just build an extra height on the wing? And
Yeah.
I wouldn't say silly people, but that's not quite what I'm mentioning. But it is the sort of, we built a sea defense. What do you mean we have to build another sea defense? The first one was expensive, and you're telling me it's not going to protect us.
Yeah. It's very interesting how when you start to go through these things, it isn't just coastal defenses that need strengthening. It's the loss of land, it's the loss of livelihood, it's the loss of basically making food. And it's also the increase of things like, well, perhaps mosquitoes. We're looking at, if the sea levels rise and it's the right sort of temperature, then we're looking at the spread of malaria to larger parts of the world, because they're going to be warmer and, of course, a little bit wetter. And that's going to cause even more problems. So, yeah, and it's not just that disease. It's going to be a whole series of different sort of
We're not talking about
problems.
say waterborne ones, but it is more because of just how the water's got closer to the people, and therefore that sort of situation, as opposed to directly being from the sea.
Yeah. So you've been listening to the Going Green podcast, looking at water rising, sea levels rising. Basically, it's too late to stop it. All we can do now is prevent it, and also prevent it rising even more. Until next time, you've been listening to the Going Green podcast. Thank you for listening and maybe watching. Goodbye from me.
Yes, and a goodbye from me.
Bye bye.
Bye.